Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Ins Division. I'm Glenn Reynolds, and once again, I'm joined by one of nature's noblemen, a fellow law professor. It's an esteemed profession, and you know, what can I say? We're the salt of the earth. I'm joined this week by Nicholas Johnson. He's a professor of law at Fordham Law School. His new book is Negroes and the Gun, The Black Tradition of Arms, which is getting a lot of attention now. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Good to see you, and hope things are going well down there.
Well, except for the snow, sure. So when people think about blacks and the civil rights movement, they tend to think of nonviolent resistance, but things weren't really quite that simple, were they?
Well, in fact, that's my central insight in the book. And one of the things that I do starting off is to acknowledge the nonviolent movement and then to describe how it is that that nonviolent theme sort of obscures this parallel tradition of arms that is something that I track in the book for periods starting in the early 1900s all the way through the 20th century.
Well, it really is an interesting story, and there's a lot of history that I think a lot of people really just don't know. The role of sort of the KKK and Jim Crow proponents in disarming black people also doesn't get a lot of attention. Birth of a Nation, which was a film that Woodrow Wilson praised, showed Klansmen disarming blacks, and at the same time there were armed blacks resisting the Klan for some time, weren't there?
Well, absolutely, and we see this from very early on, even oddly or against intuition, pre-Civil War. That is, in many of the accounts of slaves fleeing from slave catchers, slaves in the North, free blacks actually fleeing from slave catchers who were operating in the North. We see a variety of instances of armed self-defense by free blacks, by fugitive slaves, by individuals on the Underground Railroad. It's interesting in the second chapter, I've got lots of detail and several period images of blacks fighting off slave catchers with firearms, people including Harriet Tubman, but also some of the episodes that I talk about in far more detail in the book are accompanied by period images of those gunfights. So, for example, the resistance in Christiana, which involved a fugitive slave and an Underground Railroad conductor named William Parker, is the thing that I end the book with. And there's actually a nice period image of that gunfight in the book.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because you actually talk about a lot of black leaders, Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, even Martin Luther King, who distinguished nonviolent resistance from self-defense and said both of those were good.
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that I try to do as a technique in the book is to begin each chapter with either a quotation or an episode from one of the noted period leaders. So you're correct that Ida B. Wells begins the third chapter, W.E.B. Du Bois and his resistance in 1906 in Atlanta during the Atlanta race riots begins the fourth chapter, goes forward to Walter White, who was a stalwart of the NAACP, and then on to Roy Wilkins. And what I show is that throughout this period, people were taking two different views. That is, on questions of political violence, for the most part, they were adamant that political violence was a mistake, that political violence was folly and could not work, that that blacks could not achieve group goals through violence. On the other hand, they recognized uniformly, really, that armed self-defense was a crucial private resource, and this should be no surprise. We recognize this across the centuries. We recognize it across cultures. So it would actually, if you step back and think about it, be surprising if blacks had taken a different view than, in fact, they did.
Yeah, it's funny because we actually, shortly after I started writing about Second Amendment stuff back in the 90s, we had an event at my law school, and actually, Kathleen Cleaver came to speak. She was a couple of years behind me in law school, Eldridge Cleaver's ex-wife, of course, and a former Black Panther. Now she's a law professor. But what was funny was that in this event, during the sort of Q&A, we had a lot of people from the community, and this elderly black pastor, stood up to speak and said, well, of all the amendments that mattered to us, the most important was the Second Amendment because, the Klansmen were after us, but they knew we had guns, and so they left us alone. And the funny thing was, my dean at the time, who was a nice guy, but a good sort of Northeastern liberal with zero knowledge about any of this stuff, just was stunned and came up to me later and said, maybe there's something to this stuff you've been writing about. I thought it was all crazy. But so I just found that a wonderful, a teachable moment, as we say.
Well, you're right. And one of the other things, I mean, I've enjoyed and benefited from your scholarship over the years. And one of the things that people raise in this context, and it's one of the most powerful things I think that you find in the literature, is that once you get past the initial era, so the Second Amendment era, the period of the 18th century is interesting, but some of the most powerful indications that we get about the individual rights nature of the armed or the constitutional right to arms is in the context of the development of the 14th Amendment and these claims and worries and all of the things that were swirling around in the post-Civil War era. And those are intimately tied up in the concerns of newly freed slaves. And as you move forward through the end of the 19th century, all the way up through clearly the 1960s, the notion that individuals were passive or that they were relying on the government is just one that we can dismiss. And we see over and over and over again from the leadership through to the grassroots this embrace of armed self-defense as a crucial private resource, as distinct from anything that had to do with politics.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the Heller and the McDonald cases, Justice Thomas in particular really referenced this history. Do you think it's due for a larger comeback? And also, do you think there's been a deliberate or maybe an unconscious campaign to sort of airbrush the role of armed self-defense out of the history of the civil rights movement?
Well, it's interesting. This is obviously speculation. I can't account for why this has gone underrecorded. I do think it's ready for a comeback. I'm right in the middle of another book that is being written by a fellow he's now a visitor at Brown that talks about some of this history, particularly focusing on the 1960s, 1970s in Mississippi. There's another recent book by a fellow at Georgia State that chronicles, again, focusing on Mississippi and Georgia during a period basically from 1955 through 1965. So I think the story is primed for a comeback. On the point of why it's underrecorded, my charitable assessment, I guess, is that it's just very hard to get complex ideas to penetrate popular culture. So one of the things that clearly we can worry about is that people have a kind of thin and glib sense of this history and a thin and glib sense of lots of things that we should have a richer appreciation. So I'm willing to say that we can account for this by the fact that every February we have lots of television shows and headlines that talk about the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech and so forth, and that sort of occupies people's sense of what this story is about, and that getting people to appreciate the more subtle nature of the history and the complexity is something that requires additional work. This book is part of that work. There's lots of good scholarship that adds to that story. So I am hopeful that when we talk about this over the next several years, that people will start to have a generally more appreciative sense of this long history.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us here.
I'm glad to do it, and happy that you were reaching out across the airwaves and helping educate folks, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much. And that was Nicholas Johnson. He's professor of law at Fordham University Law School, and his new book is Negroes and the Gun, The Black Tradition of Arms. Well worth a read if you're interested in history or guns, or especially if you're interested in both. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to tune in. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.